Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. God is Technology. How the singularity of monotheism transcended biology and primed the technological genesis of God. All ideas are not created equal. The elimination of selection. The life of a single cell can exist because it out of equilibrium with its environment. In chemical reactions such as photosynthesis, reactants are converted into products. A state of inequality or unequilibrium is achieved by continually adding reactants and removing products. The only time in which a cell or organism does exist in equilibrium with its environment is when it is dead. Like the flat line of an electrocardiogram that indicates that a heart has stopped beating, equilibrium equals death. Ultimately, equality equals death. Somewhere along the scale from bacteria to humans, wrote Jared Diamond, we have to decide where killing becomes murder, and where eating becomes cannibalism. 74 This assumes, however, that there is an end to the reach of this idea or practice of equality. This is simply another example of what Dawkins rightly pointed out as the moving of a discontinuous, pre-Darwinian, gap between us and them. Who has the ultimate authority to dictate where the gap lies when the entire history of equality demonstrates that progress has only been made when some fought to extend the gap beyond the authoritative standard acceptable to previous progressives? If the ultimate goal of egalitarian progress is to be universal, where does this lead us? How could we even know if the goal of universal equality has reached its end? 99% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct. Any race that attempts to fulfill the abstract principles of equality is ultimately ceding its place to the very democratic rule of that extinct majority. When each and every individual organism, cell, and organelle has been reduced to a state of equality with one another, the next step is the equality of each with the larger physical world from which life arose, a state commonly known as death. The logic of destroying all differentiations of race, sex, class, and beyond ultimately leads to destroying the differentiation between the organic and the inorganic, the differentiation between the biological and the non-biological, physical world. People are material things, too, according to Darwin. To place the principle of equality at the top of a hierarchy of values is a formula for rational biological deconstruction. The death march to the land of no egalitarian hypocrisy leads to a general trajectory of evolutionary regression because it leads to equality with the most simple and primitive evolutionary forms. It is almost like descending from Homo sapiens to apes, to primates, to mammals, to amniotes, to tetrapods, to vertebrates, to animals, to eukaryotes, etc., until we are led to the very origins of life itself out of non-biological, physical matter. Yet the regression does not stop there. Atoms such as oxygen and carbon necessary for life were largely forged in the furnace of stars. The path backwards in time leads to these origins of chemical and physical evolution. The further progress of equality leads to the breakdown of molecules into equal and independent atoms. Since hydrogen is not equal to uranium, atoms must be broken down toward the state of the hydrogen masses, and then into subatomic particles. This path of progress regression leads us to the limits of contemporary knowledge at the Big Bang. Modern equality began by dismissing the importance of biology. Ultimately, it leads to the removal of all biological factors from the equation of life until the achievement of death. The logic of equality leads towards the elimination of all forms of hierarchy that separate life or biological priorities from the larger physical world. Self-consistent egalitarianism leads to self-consistent materialism. Humans and other life forms have no inherent basis for viewing themselves as chunks of superior matter, with special rights above all other material things. The idea that biology has any special privilege whatsoever over non-biology is in its very conception anti-egalitarian, and to fulfill and achieve the Enlightenment project is to engage in rational biological self-destruction. The conventional distinction between life and non-life is an extension of anthropomorphism. The belief that life forms are special matter distinct from other forms of matter is not simply a form of romanticism, it is, more specifically, a form of animism. From the perspective of unadulterated materialism, an individual human is no less a holistic construct than social group holism. The Western individual is a social construct. Just as a human being may drink a glass of water teeming with microscopic life, yet regard the water as physical matter, the entire process of an individual human swimming, and then drowning, in an ocean could be regarded as workings of physical processes without any distinct regard for the human material. Willing equality, taken to its extreme, is equivalent to willing death in equality with unadulterated materialism. Since the quantity of inorganic matter dwarfs known quantities of organic matter, democratically speaking, non-life or death wins the final victory on grounds of democratic justice. Claims of aristocracy, supremacy, or dignity above matter are reflections of bias, self-interest, or instinct. Special pleading for the moral superiority of life forms that suffer or feel pain is viviocentrism. Suffering is, and should be, reducible to material, chemical reactions in the brains and bodies of animals. The prejudice that life or animate matter is superior to inanimate matter, like the prejudice against distinct racial groups, is a form of discrimination. Just as moral action to overcome ethnocentrism leads one to treat non-kin as kin, moral action to overcome life's self-centeredness, viviocentrism, leads one to treat the non-organic as organic, to treat death as life and life as death. The overcoming of viviocentrism follows directly in the footsteps of humanism in overcoming of the kinship-centric values in which Homo sapiens originated. Willing death is thus a child of humanism and the logical culmination of its rational quest for universalism. Conventional reductionism holds that the biological and physical are ultimately equal, i.e., the biological can be reduced to the physical. Yet the only time when the biological and physical are most literally equal is when the biological system is dead. Let me put this in more common sense terms. If biology is fully consistent with the physical, then what has all the struggle been about? How is it possible to not survive? In order for survival to make any empirical sense, there must be, in some way, a distinction between life and non-life. It appears, however, that the problem of defining life is not fully possible because the definition requires an accounting of the particular environment that an organism survives against, and such environments can be incompatible or opposite for different organisms or different species. Total equivalence of an organism and its direct environment is death. Bioinconsistency is the inequality or the lack of organizational equivalence between a life form and the larger physical world. To posit bioinconsistency is another way of positing that life is a kind of myth or falsehood that is not empirically justifiable through reference to the larger environment precisely because its very existence is founded upon survival over and against that environment. On a human level, bioinconsistency typically takes the form of subjectivity that is unequal to the objectively observed physical world. Bioinconsistency is what defies complete reductionism, what defies an organism's complete death collapse into its contextual environment, i.e. myth, God, identity, poetry, culture, music, art, the fear of death, emotions, intuitions, instincts, thymos, patriarchy, politics, and other sources of value hierarchy. One of the most comprehensive expressions of bioinconsistency may be being, and especially Heidegger's talk of gods. More commonly, bioinconsistency takes the form of the empirically unverified myth that survival is good, that willing life is somehow superior to willing death. From a strictly physical standpoint, however, survival cannot be judged better than extinction. Survivalism survives, however, because the ancestors of survivors survived. It is a classic bias of living organisms, whether it is rationalized or not. That the bioinconsistent organization of an organism does not completely fall into a reductionistic collapse, consistency with its environment, may be the definition of its survival. Equality would seem to implicate an ultimate trajectory of evolutionary regression because equal rights imply the beginning of the end of Darwinian selection. A genuine, progressive implementation of universal equal rights implies the artificial end of natural selection, the systematic unraveling of the mechanism that made the evolution of life possible in the first place. The principle of equality can thus be looked at as the principle of the elimination of selection. The idea of natural right is pre-Darwinian. It is thus not especially surprising that the progress of the modern idea of the individual right to life leads in precisely the opposite direction as the progress of natural selection. The egalitarian elimination of selection is directly tied to the modern notion of leftward progress precisely because the gradual accumulation of selections that build life up suggests an equally gradual elimination of selections to unravel life down. The opposite of the modern idea of individual rights is the right of the stronger. Individual rights tend to defend the weaker, while natural selection tends to eliminate the weaker. From some points of view, then, equal rights can be looked upon as the progress of genetic maladaptation. Kin selection, for example, leads to discrimination against kinship outsiders and altruism towards kinship insiders. The moral logic of egalitarian universalism works in precisely the opposite direction, with moral preference given to outsiders over insiders. Western institutionalization of the elimination of discrimination ultimately means the systematic elimination of selection. Eliminating selection ultimately leads to internationalism and trans-species universalism. It also implies the elimination of the political as an active means of evolutionary, eugenic, biological self-control. Insofar as Jews have contributed disproportionately to Western egalitarianism, and the end of discrimination on biological grounds, Jews have contributed to the elimination of biological selection. Since antisemitism has been a mortal form of discrimination, Jews, in selecting for the elimination of selection, have selected for their own survival. Jews have been prominent selectors of the ethics of anti-selection, and this amounts to the moral relinquishment of active political control over biological evolution. Yet is the superior egalitarianism of Jews the most worthless or delusional kind of superiority possible? Are Jews leading the entire human race towards an evolutionary dead end? Are Jews, for the sake of their own biological survival, leading the human race as a whole towards rational evolutionary self-destruction?